The door to the police station swung open, and Marcus Caldwell stepped inside, bringing a cold gust of wind with him. Dressed in a sharp dark coat, Marcus moved with a sense of purpose, his eyes scanning the room like a predator searching for its next meal. He was a reporter with a reputation, a man who could twist any story into gold, even if it meant bending the truth a little, or a lot. Today, his target was the story of Daniel Kingsley's death, a top businessman found frozen in his own home, his face locked in an expression of sheer terror. The case had made headlines, but no one knew what had really happened. There were whispers of strange circumstances, rumours about the cabin where Daniel had stayed, but nothing concrete. That's where Marcus came in. He walked up to the front desk, flashing a smile at the officer seated there. "Morning," he said, his tone smooth, almost too friendly. "I'm Marcus Caldwell, with the Weekly Spotlight. I was hoping to speak with the lead detective on the Kingsley case." The officer looked up, his expression immediately souring. "You're the reporter, right?" he asked, his voice flat. "We've had enough of your kind around here." Marcus kept his smile, but it was strained. "I'm just trying to get some details, that's all. I think the public deserves to know what's going on, especially with all the speculation." The officer didn't budge. "Detective Ruiz isn't taking any more questions on this case. We've already made a statement." Marcus's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Look, I'm not here to make trouble. I just want a quick word with him, off the record if necessary. I promise I won't publish anything without clearing it first." The officer hesitated, clearly debating whether to throw Marcus out or let him through. Before he could decide, a gruff voice called out from across the room. "It's fine, Barnes. I'll handle him." Detective Ruiz stepped forward, his eyes hard as they met Marcus's. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man who looked like he'd seen more than his fair share of trouble. He didn't bother to hide his disdain as he approached. "Caldwell, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and steady. "I thought I told you last time to stay out of this." Marcus's smile turned into a smirk. "You know how it is, Detective. Stories like this don't just go away. People want answers." Ruiz stepped closer, his expression darkening. "There's nothing more to say. It's a tragic case and that's it. The rest is just wild speculation. If I catch you digging where you shouldn't be, I'll make sure you regret it." Marcus raised his hands, feigning innocence. Of course. I'm just following up on some leads. Speaking of which, I heard something interesting about a cabin." Ruiz's eyes flickered, and for a split second, Marcus saw the detective's guarded expression slip. "What about it?" Ruiz asked, his tone sharp. "Just that Daniel Kingsley had been staying there before." "Well, you know," Marcus said, leaning in slightly. "I'm curious why no one's talking about that. Seems like a key part of the story, don't you think?" Ruiz didn't answer, but the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. Marcus knew he was onto something, and he wasn't going to let it go. "Listen, Detective," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If there's nothing there, I'll back off. But if you're hiding something, I'm going to find out. It's better for both of us if I get ahead of this. Don't you think?" Ruiz glared at him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, signalling that the conversation was over. Marcus took that as his cue to leave, but as he turned to go, he saw another officer whispering something to Ruiz, and for a moment they both glanced at Marcus. Outside the station, Marcus slipped into his car and pulled out his phone. He had gotten what he needed, a sliver of information. He made a call, reaching out to a contact who used to work with the police before being quietly pushed out. The kind of person who still had access to old files and didn't mind sharing for the right price. "Hey, it's Marcus Caldwell," he said when the line picked up. "I need a favour. Can you find me the last known address for a cabin up near Coldwater Ridge?" "Yeah, that's the one. No, I don't care how much it costs. Just get it to me." An hour later, Marcus had what he wanted: an address, directions, and a brief warning to be careful. He didn't care. All he could think about was the headline: "The Dark Secrets of Coldwater Ridge. What really happened to Daniel Kingsley?" He packed his gear, his camera, night vision equipment, and a voice recorder. If there was something at that cabin, he was going to find it, and he was going to make sure everyone knew. Marcus drove through the winding roads, the sun setting behind him as he made his way deeper into the forest. The sky turned dark, and the trees grew thicker, swallowing the last traces of daylight. By the time he reached the cabin, the world was bathed in shadows, the air cold and still. The cabin was exactly as he had imagined it: old, isolated, with an eerie stillness hanging around it. It looked untouched, as if Daniel had just stepped out and never returned. Marcus stepped out of his car, his breath visible in the frigid air, and grabbed his gear. He felt a thrill of excitement as he approached the front door, the possibilities racing through his mind. "All right, let's see what we've got," he muttered to himself, turning on his camera and stepping inside. The cabin was dark, but Marcus's night vision camera picked up everything: scattered belongings, a broken lamp, and on the table, a notebook. Daniel's notes. Marcus's eyes lit up as he flipped through the pages, catching glimpses of frantic scribbles and cryptic references to something called the Pale Whisperer. He smiled, the thrill of the hunt washing over him. Whatever this was, it was going to be big. He set up his camera near the window, positioning it to capture any movement outside. As he adjusted the lens, he noticed something strange. The air around him felt colder, and his breath was visible, even though the heating was on. "Perfect," he whispered, switching on the night vision mode and scanning the darkness outside. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding, Daniel." As he began to read through Daniel's notes, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. For a moment, Marcus thought he heard something, a soft, distant whisper. He froze, listening, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. He shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Getting jumpy, Caldwell. Don't lose it now." But as the night deepened, the cabin seemed to shift around him. The shadows grew longer, the cold more intense. Marcus adjusted his camera, glancing out the window, and that's when he saw it. A figure, far off, standing just at the edge of the tree line. Marcus zoomed in, the camera glitching slightly, but he could just make out the shape. A tall, thin figure, barely visible in the darkness. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he realized the figure wasn't moving. It was watching. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pushed it aside, the thrill of the story driving him forward. "Gotcha," he whispered, his finger pressing down on the record button. He didn't realize, not yet, that this time the story had him. Marcus sat in the dimly lit cabin, his hands trembling as he checked his camera. He frowned, scrolling through the footage. Nothing. The screen showed only static, as if the camera had malfunctioned. "No, that's impossible," he muttered, tapping the device. He had been recording the entire time, every creak, every whisper. But now, there was no evidence. It was like the camera had been wiped clean. He set it down, a sense of unease creeping over him. The air inside the cabin was colder than before, and his breath fogged up in the dim light. As he sat there, trying to make sense of the glitch, he heard it again, a faint, almost inaudible whisper.
"Marcus,
He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was so soft, like a breath carried on the wind, but it was clear enough to send chills down his spine. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing there. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice wavering, but the only response was silence. Thud. The sudden, sharp noise made him jump. It sounded like something heavy hitting the wall outside. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, shining it toward the door, but the light barely pierced the darkness. The cabin seemed to be closing in on him, the shadows growing deeper, thicker. The whispers returned, this time louder, overlapping, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. They were still too faint to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, accusatory, taunting. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices only grew louder, echoing inside his head, like a chorus of distorted murmurs. Thud, thud, thud. The banging grew more intense, coming from different parts of the cabin. First the wall, then the window, then the ceiling, as if something was trying to force its way inside. Marcus's heart raced, his mind spinning as he struggled to hold on to his composure. He didn't want to believe in the stories, the legends, but something was here, something that wanted him to know it was watching. "Stop it," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I'm not scared of you." The whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence that felt even more unsettling. Marcus held his breath, his pulse throbbing in his ears, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside, rattling in the shutters. Then, without warning, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. Marcus screamed, stumbling backward, his flashlight slipping from his hand and rolling across the floor. The cold air rushed in, swirling around the room, and for a split second, he thought he saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, tall and thin, with long silver hair. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The door banged shut, plunging the cabin back into silence. Marcus was left standing in the darkness, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. He didn't know what was real anymore, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. City, the newspaper office. Back in the bustling city, the office of the Weekly Spotlight was anything but quiet. Phones rang, printers hummed, and journalists rushed to meet deadlines, but in the editor's office there was only frustration. "Where the hell is Marcus?" growled Charlie Briggs, the editor-in-chief, slamming his fist on the desk. He was a grizzled veteran of the news industry, with a short temper and a no-nonsense attitude. "I sent him out there days ago, and I haven't heard a damn thing." Two of his team, Tina Marshall and Jack Collins, stood across from him, exchanging uneasy glances. They had both worked with Marcus before, and while he was known for being a bit reckless, it wasn't like him to disappear without checking in. "Maybe he's still digging, boss," Tina suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "You know how he gets when he's onto something." Charlie glared at her, shaking his head. "No, this isn't like him. I need that story for the deadline, and if he's not back here by tomorrow, we're screwed. I'm not going to let this whole thing fall apart because he decided to play ghost hunter." He grabbed a crumpled piece of paper from his desk and tossed it at them. "This is the last location he sent me, some old cabin out by Coldwater Ridge. I want you two to head out there and bring him back. I don't care what it takes." Tina picked up the paper, glancing at the scribbled address. "You want us to just drive out there and find him? What if he's not—" "Just do it," Charlie snapped, cutting her off. "If he's not there, then I want to know why. And if he is, tell him to get his ass back here with a story, or he can find himself a new job." Jack nodded, though he looked less than thrilled about the assignment. "All right, we'll go. But if he's not answering, there might be a reason. Maybe you should do what I tell you to do and stop wasting time, Charlie interrupted, his eyes narrowing. I've got a newspaper to run, and I'm not waiting around for him to play detective. Get out there, find him, and make sure he has something to show for it. With that, he turned away, already grabbing the phone to bark orders at someone else. Tina and Jack exchanged a final look, then headed for the door. They both knew this was more than just a routine follow-up. Something about the way Marcus had vanished didn't sit right, and they had a feeling this trip to the cabin was going to be more than they bargained for. Tina gripped the steering wheel as the car wound its way through the dark, narrow roads, the snow beginning to fall heavily. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the swirling flakes that danced across their path. Beside her, Jack stared out the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Neither of them had spoken much since they left the city, but as the miles stretched on, the silence became harder to bear. Didn't think I'd be out here looking for Marcus of all people, Jack muttered, finally breaking the silence. He shifted in his seat, his expression tight with unease. I mean, the guy's relentless, but I've never known him to just vanish. Tina nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yeah, well, maybe he bit off more than he could chew this time. You know how he gets when he thinks there's a big story. He doesn't care who he ticks off or what rules he breaks. Still, Jack said, it's not like him to go radio silent, especially when he was so eager to dig into this whole Daniel Kingsley thing. Makes you wonder what he found. Or what found him, Tina said quietly, almost to herself. Jack turned to look at her, frowning, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she tightened her grip on the wheel, as if bracing herself for whatever they might find at the cabin. The rest of the drive was tense, the snowstorm growing fiercer as they climbed deeper into the forest. By the time they reached Coldwater Ridge, the wind was howling, whipping the snow into blinding sheets that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. When they finally pulled up to the cabin, they saw Marcus's car parked out front, half buried in snow. But what made Tina's stomach twist was the sight of the cabin door, wide open, swinging back and forth in the wind. The light inside flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting strange shadows across the threshold. He's got to be here, Jack said, though his voice was more uncertain than confident. Why would he leave the door open like that? Tina didn't respond. She parked the car, cut in the engine, and they both sat there for a moment, neither wanting to be the first to step out into the cold. Eventually, they grabbed their flashlights and made their way through the snow, the wind biting at their faces as they approached the cabin. Inside, the scene was chaotic. The door creaked on its hinges, and the wind had blown snow across the floor, leaving wet, slushy patches everywhere. Marcus's gear was scattered around the room, but there was no sign of him. "Marcus?" Tina called out, but only the wind answered, whistling through the cracks in the walls. They searched the cabin, checking every room, every corner, but there was nothing, just empty silence. "Where the hell is he?" Jack said, frustration creeping into his voice. "His car's here, his stuff's here, but he's just gone." Tina's eyes drifted over to the table, where something caught her attention. It was Marcus's camera, lying on its side. She picked it up, hesitating for a moment before hitting the play button on the viewer. The screen flickered to life, and there was Marcus, his face illuminated by the eerie green light of the night vision mode. He looked frantic, his eyes wide with fear, darting around the room as if expecting something to jump out at him at any moment. The audio crackled, and they could hear him muttering to himself, though the words were barely coherent. Then the image shook violently as Marcus seemed to stumble, his voice rising into a scream. "No! Get away from me! Stop it!" he shouted, But there was nothing on the screen, just the empty room, and Marcus backing away from something unseen. The footage continued, but what came next was even stranger. Marcus was standing completely still, staring blankly ahead, his eyes glazed over. The video kept rolling for hours, showing him in the same position, unmoving, as if he were frozen in place. Then abruptly, the camera cut off, the screen going dark. Tina and Jack exchanged a horrified look. "What the hell was that?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Tina said, her hand shaking as she set the camera down. "But whatever happened to him? It's not normal." The storm outside had grown worse, and the temperature inside the cabin was dropping fast. Tina glanced at her watch, noting how late it was. "We're not going anywhere tonight. We'll wait out the storm and head back in the morning. We just need to get some rest and—" Thud. They both jumped, their heads snapping toward the sound. It was a soft knock, almost polite, but in the dead silence of the cabin, it was as loud as a gunshot. Tina's heart raced as she shone her flashlight toward the door, but there was nothing there. And then came the whispers, faint, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably there, seeping into their minds like a cold mist, words they couldn't quite make out, but with a tone that was dark, sinister, and knowing. Jack shivered, rubbing his arms as if trying to ward off the chill. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tina nodded, but she didn't trust herself to speak. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, circling around them, filling the room with a sense of creeping dread. She turned her flashlight toward the corners, but every time she thought she saw something, it slipped back into the shadows, just out of sight. Thud. 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 The knocks became more frantic, coming from all around the cabin, the walls, the windows, even the floor beneath their feet. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be speaking directly into their minds. "What do we do?" Jack asked, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here. We have to get out." "Wait," Tina said, holding up a hand as she heard something new, a voice, clear and distinct, cutting through the noise. Knock, knock. Then, as if to answer, a louder knock echoed from the front door, and a voice called out, muffled but audible over the storm. "Anyone there?" Tina and Jack froze, staring at the door. The voice sounded calm, almost casual, completely at odds with the chaos that had been building around them. For a moment, they both hesitated, unsure whether to open the door or run in the opposite direction. "Hello?" the voice called again. "I know someone's in there. Are you going to let me in out of the cold?" Tina's hand moved to the doorknob, her pulse hammering in her ears. She glanced at Jack, who nodded, though his face was pale with fear. Slowly, she turned the knob and pulled the door open. Standing on the porch, framed by the swirling snow, was a man, tall, with a gentle, almost friendly smile, his eyes bright and warm despite the frigid air. He looked out of place, as if he had just stepped off a street corner, rather than trudged through a snowstorm to reach the cabin. "Well," the man said, his smile widening as he looked at them both. "Are you going to let me in, or are you planning to leave me out here to freeze?" Tina and Jack stared at him, their minds racing, but before they could respond, the man stepped forward, still smiling, and the wind howled, slamming the door shut behind him. "Thank you," the man said, stepping into the cabin and brushing snow from his coat. "My car is just there, but standing outside, waiting for you to open the door, was bitterly cold." He looked around the room, his eyes sharp, almost playful. "Anyway, my name is Steven Lestat." As he spoke his name, a faint rumble of thunder echoed somewhere in the distance. Despite the heavy snowstorm, the sound was low, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down Tina and Jack's spines. They exchanged a quick, nervous glance before turning back to Steven, who stood there with a calm, knowing smile. "I thought this cabin was supposed to be empty," Steven said, his voice smooth, almost amused. His eyes flicked over their faces, studying them with a quiet intensity. "But no matter. Now that we're all here, we should get this place warm. It's as cold as the grave in Hilde." Something about this man was off, unsettling. He had an air of confidence, of authority, that seemed out of place, especially given the circumstances. Tina and Jack felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity as they watched him move around the room, casually inspecting the cabin as if he owned it. "So," Steven said, turning back to them, "what are you two doing here?" Tina hesitated, but Jack spoke up. "We're looking for a colleague of ours. His name is Marcus Caldwell. He was supposed to be here, but we haven't heard from him in days. His car is outside, but there's no sign of him." Steven's eyes lit up with interest. "Ah, a search party. How noble of you. And did you find anything? Any clues as to where your friend might have gone?" "No," Tina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just his camera. And some strange footage." "Strange, you say?" Steven replied, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, I do love a good mystery." There was a pause, the air thick with tension, before Steven clapped his hands together, the sound echoing through the room. "Right then, let's get a fire going, shall we? It's freezing in here." Reluctantly, Tina and Jack set about warming the cabin, gathering wood and stoking the embers in the fireplace. Steven stood by, watching them with a bemused expression, as if this was all a game he found particularly amusing. Once the fire was crackling and the room began to warm, they all settled down, the light from the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. The atmosphere seemed to ease, the warmth seeping into their bones, and for a moment Tina and Jack almost allowed themselves to relax, but that sense of calm was shattered when the whispers returned. Soft, insistent, like voices just beyond hearing, they crept into the room, circling around them. Tina stiffened, her eyes wide with fear, and Jack gripped the arm of his chair, his knuckles turning white. Steven, however, did not react the way they expected. Instead of fear, a look of delight spread across his face, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Oh, how exciting," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You were right, my lord." He turned slightly, as if speaking to someone unseen. "She is here." Tina and Jack exchanged a horrified glance. You know what those noises are?" Jack stammered, his voice barely steady. "Of course," Steven said, still smiling. "The whispers, the knocks, they are signs. Signs that she's near, waiting to make her presence known. You two are very fortunate, you know. Not everyone gets to witness something like this." Who is she?" Tina asked, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. Steven's smile widened, but he didn't respond directly. Instead, he stood up, brushing off his coat, and walked over to the door. "Now, my friends, I'm afraid it's time for you to leave." "What?" Jack said, confusion and fear mixing in his voice. "But the storm—" Yes, I know," Steven interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "The snow is thick, the night is dark, but if you go slow, you should make it back to the main road without much trouble. And trust me, you'll be much safer out there than you would be if you stayed here." Tina and Jack stared at him, trying to understand. "You're telling us to leave?" Tina said. "Just like that?" Steven's eyes darkened, and for a moment there was a flicker of something cold and dangerous behind his smile. "Yes, I am. It would be unwise for you to stay, and if by chance you should have an accident out there in the darkness." He paused, leaning in slightly. "Don't worry. I could still make use of you." Tina and Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. There was no arguing with this man. His words were both a warning and a threat. They gathered their belongings as quickly as they could, every nerve screaming for them to run, but they forced themselves to move calmly, not wanting to provoke whatever sinister presence had come into the cabin. They stepped outside, the storm slapping them in the face with cold, wet snow. The wind howled, and the darkness seemed to swallow them up as they made their way to the car, their minds reeling, hearts pounding. Neither of them spoke as they climbed in, started the engine, and drove off into the night, desperate to put as much distance between themselves and that place as possible. Inside the cabin, Steven stood by the fire, watching the flames dance. The whispers had grown louder, filling the room with their eerie, rhythmic cadence. But he did not seem afraid. Quite the opposite. He looked content, as if everything was going according to plan. When the sound of the car engine faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and the crackle of the fire, Steven moved to the centre of the room. He stood there, his eyes half closed, listening to the whispers as if they were an old, familiar song. "Now," he said softly, his voice echoing through the empty cabin, "now that we're alone, let's have ourselves a little talk." The whispers seemed to respond, rising in intensity, and Steven's smile grew, his eyes glinting with a cold, dark light. The fire flared up, casting long shadows across the walls, and for a moment the room seemed to tremble, as if something vast and terrible was drawing closer, and then everything went silent. Steven Lestat wrapped his thick coat tightly around himself, bracing against the bitter cold as he stepped out of the cabin and into the snow. The storm had subsided, but the air was still frigid, the sky a dull grey that hinted at more snow to come. He adjusted his scarf, his breath misting in front of him as he began to walk, venturing deeper into the dark, silent woods. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with frost. As he walked, he moved with purpose, unhurried, almost as if he were taking a casual stroll. But there was nothing casual about his mission. He was there for a reason that few would dare to understand. After some time, he paused, glancing around the empty forest. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening for something beyond the wind. "I can feel you're afraid," he said softly, his voice carrying through the stillness. "You don't need to be. Necros is the reason you came back, and I am here at his will." He continued walking, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. "You see, my lord is quite intrigued by your existence. He has allowed you to roam, to hunt, to claim those who wander too far. But now, he wishes to understand you." The forest was silent, the only sound the distant rustling of branches in the wind. But then, faintly, a shape appeared between the trees, far off, barely visible. Steven's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of it. A tall, gaunt figure with long silver hair, flowing like wisps of smoke in the breeze. "Ah, there you are," he said, his lips curling into a smile. "I am not here to harm you. I am simply here to understand you. You are unique, a creature returned from the dead, which is a specialty for me and my family. Your power is great, and we simply want to know more about it." The pale whisperer stood motionless, her form barely distinguishable from the shadows around her. Her presence was cold, oppressive, and Steven could feel it seeping through the air, trying to pierce his thoughts, to find a way into his mind, but he remained calm, his smile unwavering. The wind shifted, and suddenly the world around him seemed to distort, the trees blurring, the snow swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. Steven felt a sharp, icy chill pass through him, and then he saw it. A vision, a glimpse into a time long forgotten, projected from the pale whisperer herself. The scene shifted, and Stephen found himself standing on the edge of a small village, the air thick with smoke from hearth fires. In the distance, he saw her, a woman, young and frail, standing on the outskirts, her hands clutching a basket of herbs. She looked scared, desperate, her eyes darting back toward the village, as if expecting someone to chase her. The whispers of the villagers carried on the wind, harsh and cruel. Witch, poisoner, evil. The words echoed, and the woman's face twisted with pain. She had been a healer, using herbs to cure the sick, but the villagers had turned against her, blaming her for every misfortune, every illness that struck their homes. Stephen watched as she was forced out, cast into the wilderness, the village gates closing behind her. The cold bit into her skin, the wind tearing at her clothes. She wandered through the snow, lost and alone with no shelter, no food. The days passed, and her strength faded, her footsteps growing slower, weaker. He saw her stumble, her frail body collapsing into the snow. The wind howled around her, drowning out her cries. And in that moment, as her life slipped away, she whispered a curse, a final, desperate vow. "I will return. I will have my revenge. They will all pay." The vision darkened, and Stephen felt a presence, a dark, ancient power, watching from the shadows. It was Necros, the lord of the undead, drawn to her hatred, her determination to defy death itself. He heard her plea, and in his cold, twisted mercy, he answered. The snow around her body shifted, forming into dark tendrils that wrapped around her limbs, pulling her back from the brink. She gasped, her eyes snapping open, glowing with an unnatural light. Necros granted her the gift of undeath, binding her spirit to the cold, to the darkness, allowing her to return, but not as she once was. She became something else, something more. The villagers never knew what hit them. One by one they vanished, their screams lost to the wind, their bodies never found. The legend of the Pale Whisperer was born, a story told to frighten children, to warn them not to stray too far from the village, lest they too fall prey to the spirit that lingered in the cold. The vision faded, and Stephen was back in the woods, the Pale Whisperer still standing in the distance, watching him. He could feel her power, her hatred, as if it were a tangible thing, pressing down on him, but he did not flinch. "This is good," Stephen said, his voice low and calm. "You were once a woman, cast out, left to die, but you returned, and now you walk these woods, claiming those who wander too far. Fascinating." He took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "I wish to understand you." The air grew colder, and Stephen felt a pressure in his mind, like icy fingers trying to dig into his thoughts, to twist his emotions, to make him feel the fear that the Pale Whisperer thrived on. But instead of recoiling, he laughed, the sound echoing through the empty woods. "You cannot harm me," he said, his smile widening. "I am protected by our Lord. Necros has granted me his favour, and as long as he wills it, I am beyond your reach." The Pale Whisperer seemed to waver, her form flickering like a shadow caught in a storm. The whispers around them grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to drown out Stephen's words. But he stood firm, his eyes locked on hers, unafraid. "Now," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing, "let's see what else you have to show me. We're alone after all, and I have all the time in the world." The woods fell silent, the air still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Steven Lestat turned away from the Pale Whisperer, the cold wind whipping around him as he made his way back through the snowy woods. He walked with a purpose, a satisfied smile on his lips, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. He didn't look back, but he spoke clearly, his voice carrying through the silence. "Thank you," he said, his tone almost reverent. "Thank you, Pale Whisperer." The figure remained still, watching him from the shadows, her hollow, dark eyes unblinking. Stephen paused for a moment, as if savouring the stillness of the moment, then continued. "I have the knowledge I need. We are now allies under Necros. You are free to take those who venture into these woods, as you have always done. But understand this. You are no longer bound by them." He stopped, glancing over his shoulder, his eyes gleaming with a cold, dark light. "You are free," he said, his smile widening, "and there are so many more people in the city waiting, unaware. I will be your ally in death, guiding them to you." The Pale Whisperer remained silent, her form barely distinguishable from the dark trees, but the air around her seemed to shift, a cold wave radiating outward, as if she understood his words. Stephen nodded, satisfied. "I now have the knowledge I sought," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Soon death will walk this earth once again, and it will not be limited to these woods. It will spread, reaching far beyond this place." Months later, a new visitor. The cabin sat quietly in the woods, untouched and undisturbed. Snow piled high on the roof, the storm having passed long ago, leaving a serene stillness behind. For months there had been no strange noises, no whispers in the night, no frantic knocks or screams. It was as if the cabin had finally been left in peace. Then, one evening, a new visitor arrived. A man, tired from the long drive, seeking a retreat from the chaos of his daily life. He parked his car, unloaded his bags, and stepped inside, smiling as he took in the rustic charm of the place. It was exactly what he had been looking for, a place to disconnect, to unwind. He didn't notice the way the shadows seemed to deepen around the cabin, or how the air grew colder, just for a moment, as he stepped inside. He was alone, or so he thought, and the stillness of the place comforted him. There were no whispers, no unsettling sounds to disturb his peace. But the cabin was no longer the epicenter. The dark presence that had once haunted its walls had found a new playground, a new hunting ground. Far from the isolated cabin, the city hummed with life. People rushed through the streets, cars honked, and lights flickered in the distance. But at the edge of the city, just beyond the bustling noise and activity, a cold mist began to gather, rolling in like a slow, creeping tide. The air grew frigid, biting at the skin of those who walked too close to the foggy outskirts. And there, at the boundary between the city and the wilderness, stood the Pale Whisperer. Her tall, gaunt figure loomed in the mist, her long, silver hair drifting like wisps of smoke. She watched the city, her dark eyes unblinking, her presence seeping into the shadows, spreading through the alleyways and streets like a silent plague. The cold surrounded her, a chill that went beyond the physical, cutting into the soul. She could feel the life of the city pulsing, vibrant and full, and she smiled, knowing it was all within her reach. She was no longer confined to the woods. She had been given the freedom to claim more than just the occasional wanderer. She would take many, and she would not be stopped. Stephen's laboratory, the power of undeath. In a dark, hidden laboratory far from the woods, Steven Lestat stood over an operating table, his eyes glinting with manic excitement. The room was filled with strange, arcane equipment, tubes and vials bubbling with unknown liquids, and the air was thick with the scent of chemicals and decay. On the table lay a single corpse, pale and lifeless, its eyes closed. Stephen watched, his breath held, as he completed the final adjustments, a sense of anticipation building within him. "This is it," he whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he placed his tools aside. The power of undeath, the power to raise the dead. He took a step back, his gaze fixed on the body, and then slowly the corpse began to move. Its chest rose, a shallow, ragged breath escaping its lips, and its fingers twitched, curling into a fist. The eyes opened, dull and glassy, but unmistakably alive. Steven smiled, a look of triumph spreading across his face. "Yes," he said softly, his voice echoing in the dim room. "That's it. Rise, my son." The corpse sat up, its movements slow and stiff, as if awakening from a long, dreamless sleep. Steven watched, his eyes shining with a dark, twisted joy. "Soon you will have 1,000,000 brothers, my son," he said, his voice growing louder, more fervent. 1,000,000 followers of Necros shall walk this earth, and death will reign once more. The pale whisperer was free, and now Steven had the key to bringing the dead back to life. Together, they would unleash a darkness that had not been seen in centuries, a darkness that would spread across the world, consuming all in its path. And as the first of the dead stood before him, obedient and silent, Steven Lestat's laughter filled the room, echoing through the dark halls, a chilling promise of what was to come. The pale whisperer, the dark descent. The city sleeps, unaware of the creeping shadow that now lurks at its edge. A cold mist rolls through the streets, curling around lampposts, seeping into dark alleys, and wrapping itself around the unsuspecting. The pale whisperer has come, no longer confined to the silent woods, but free to hunt in the heart of the city. Her presence is a chill in the air, a whisper on the wind, a flicker of movement in the corner of your eye. Those who hear her voice feel an icy hand on their soul, dragging them toward a fate they cannot escape. I am no longer bound, and you will not escape me. Meanwhile, deep underground, in a forgotten part of the city, Steven Lestat's plan unfolds. The first of his undead army awakens, hollow eyes glowing in the darkness, cold breath rising from decaying lips. More and more rise to join him, brought back from the dead, their faces expressionless, their movements mechanical, but their purpose clear. You shall rise, my children. You will walk this earth once more, and the living shall fall before you. The whispers grow louder, the mist thicker, as the pale whisperer and the army of Necros converge, a dark alliance, ready to unleash chaos and death. There's no place left to hide, no safety in the crowded streets. The city is a playground for the damned, and the night belongs to them. But as the darkness descends, a single question remains: what can stop them? The shadows close in, and the whispers carry a single, chilling promise. You cannot escape death. It is already here.